Let's talk about solving quadratic equations by completing the square. All right, so first of all, let's start with a very simple example. Simple quadratic equation, x squared equals 49. So the simplest way to solve this is just to undo what's happening to x. X is being squared, so the inverse operation of squaring x would be to take the square root of x. So let's take the square root of both sides, and we'll get the square root of x squared is x, but then on the right, remember that there are two real numbers that I can square to get 49. One of them would be -7, and the other one would be +7. And the way that we can write that kind of in shorthand is just to say plus or minus 7. So this is just the short way of representing our two solutions, x equals -7 and x equals +7. You don't have to write it separately. This will do right here. So now in this example, much like the last one, if we have a perfect square on both sides, well, we don't have to have a perfect square on both sides, but if the left side is a perfect square, we can simplify, or we can solve for x by taking the square root of both sides. The square root of x plus 9 quantity squared will just give us x plus 9. And then the square root of 36, remember there are two, 36 actually has two square roots, a positive one or a negative one. So we're going to write plus or minus 36. So now to find our two solutions, let's go ahead and rewrite two separate equations. The first one, let's say x plus 9 equals -6, and the other one would be when x plus 9 equals +6. Then we'll solve both of those equations for x. On the first one, we'll get x equals -15, because -6 minus 9 more would give us -15. And our second solution then would be when x equals -3. Okay, in this next example, I hope that you recognize that this trinomial is a trinomial that's a perfect square. It fits this pattern. A squared plus, or actually it's minus in this case. Let me fix that. A squared minus 2ab plus b squared, where the first term and the last term are perfect squares. If you take their square roots, which would be x and 8, if you multiply those together and double, you're going to get this middle term. So you should recognize this trinomial as a perfect square. So since it's a perfect square, there is a binomial that we can square to get it, and that binomial would be x minus 8 quantity squared. That's a skill you would have practiced in your Algebra 1 class. Okay, so now we can solve this quadratic equation by taking the square root of both sides. Okay, so on the left we would get x minus 8, and on the right the square root of the square root of 4 is plus or minus 2. Okay, so now let's write our two separate equations. So that means x minus 8 is either equal to -2 or x minus 8 is equal to +2. And then solving those two little equations, we'll get that x is equal to 6 or x is equal to 10 when we add 8 to both sides. Okay, so we finally come to an example where we actually need to, if we want to solve this equation by taking the square root of both sides, we need to make sure that this left side is a perfect square. It's not right now, so we're going to make that happen by completing the square. Completing the square. Okay, so to complete the square, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to move this -8 term. That's the term that makes this trinomial not be a perfect square. So we're going to move it to the right side just by adding 8 to both sides. So we'll get x squared minus 2x. Then I want you to leave some space there for just a minute, because what we're going to do now is we're going to add a number in this spot that will complete the square, that will make this trinomial a perfect square. The original trinomial was not a perfect square. We're going to make this a perfect square. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a number to both sides, and make sure you remember that if you add a number to the left side, you have to add that same number to the right side in order to maintain the equality, to keep the left side equal to the right side. So to find this number, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the coefficient of the x term. We're going to take half of that and square it. So if I take -2 and I take half of that, that's -1. And then I'm going to square negative 1, which would give me a positive 1. So I'm going to add 1 to both sides. We did that to complete the square on the left side. So let me just remind you how I came up with this number. You find the number by take half the coefficient of x, and square, whoops, that should be a D, sorry, and square it, and square. Okay, so once again, the coefficient of x is -2, half of -2 is -1, and -1 squared, -1 times -1 is +1. And then just a reminder again, if I add 1 to the left side, make sure you add 1 to the right side. That way the left side is still equal to the right side. So now what I've done is I've created a trinomial that's a perfect square. So I'm going to factor that. That will factor to x minus 1 quantity squared. And now I can find my solution by simply taking the square root of both sides. All right, so when we do that, we get x minus 1 is equal to plus or minus 3, the square root of minus 3. Now let's write those two solutions. That means x minus 1 is either equal to -3 or x minus 1 is equal to +3. So we'll solve those two little equations and we get x equals -2 for one of our solutions, and the other solution, when we add 1 to both sides, gives us x is equal to 4.